The phone you're holding was probably manufactured across 12 different countries. And somehow, all of it reached you, probably within a few weeks, for just a few dollars. But how? Technology? Free trade? Globalization? No. The real reason is something simple, powerful, and almost never discussed: cheap energy. By the time this video ends, you'll see the global economy, geopolitics, and the crisis we're living through in a completely different way. Welcome to Economic History, a place where the untold truths about money, power, and economic history, and how they shape our world today, are revealed. In 1800, the richest country in the world was India, or China. That part is debated, but one thing is certain: Western Europe was economically ordinary for most of human history. Why? Because back then, the cost of everything was transportation, and transportation costs were incredibly high. How many tons of goods could a horse pulling a cart carry in a day, and for how many kilometers? Limited. How fast could a sailing ship travel? Depended on the wind. Unreliable. Expensive. There was no true global trade in that world. Only goods that were extremely valuable, very light, and took up little space were transported. Spices, silk, gold, porcelain, wheat, iron, coal. You wouldn't transport them. It wasn't profitable. Then in 1769, James Watt improved the steam engine, and the world was reborn. The steam engine was more than a tool. For the first time, it made energy portable and controllable. You no longer had to be near a river. You didn't need to wait for the wind. You could generate power wherever you wanted, whenever you wanted. This was the greatest leap in human history since agriculture. In the 18th century, Britain happened to possess a very special geography. Its coal reserves were located close to the coasts. That coincidence changed the course of history. Thanks to cheap coal, the British could run steam engines in factories. They could build steamships. They could reach every corner of the world. And that's when it began. The first true globalization in human history. In 1820, mail between London and New York took 4 to 6 weeks. By 1870, steamships reduced that journey to 10 days. By 1900, just 7 days. This wasn't merely speed, it was a revolution that changed the physics of trade. Because as transportation time fell, transportation costs fell. And as transportation costs fell, goods that previously weren't worth shipping suddenly became profitable to move. Wheat from Argentina reached England. Cotton from India entered the factories of Manchester. Wool from Australia flowed into Europe. Globalization was not an ideology. Globalization was the inevitable result of cheap energy. As energy became cheaper, distance dissolved. And as distance dissolved, the world shrank. Coal created the first globalization, but oil took it to an entirely different dimension. Why was oil so special? Because in terms of energy density, oil contained twice as much energy as coal, the same weight, double the energy. And because it was liquid, transporting it was much easier. Think about it. Coal had to be loaded manually onto ships and reloaded at every port. Oil could simply be pumped, both while loading and unloading. But oil's true revolution came in 1956, and very few people know this. An American truck driver named Malcolm McLean was waiting at a port one day. Workers were unloading cargo piece by piece with cranes, and it took hours. Then McLean thought, what if all goods were placed into standardized boxes? That's how the shipping container was born. The idea seemed small, but its impact exploded. Before containers, shipping 1 ton of goods somewhere cost around 25 to 30% of the product's value. After containers, for the same distance, costs dropped to 1 to 2%. Think about that, from 30% to 2%. That single decision shaped the world economy for the next 60 years. It became cheaper to build factories in China and ship products to Europe than to manufacture them in Europe itself. Why? Because transportation had become almost free. The incredibly complex system we call the global supply chain was fundamentally built on one reality: When energy is cheap, distance becomes irrelevant. Now let's pause and look concretely at what cheap energy and cheap transportation created. First, the world's factory emerged. China's growth between 1980 and 2010 was not a miracle. China offered cheap labor, but cheap labor had always existed. The real difference was this: cheap transportation allowed goods made in China to reach America at near zero cost. It wasn't China's exports alone that created China. It was the cheapness of containers and oil. Second, agriculture globalized. Brazil ships bananas to Turkey. Turkey ships tomatoes to Germany. The Netherlands ships flowers all over the world. Flowers flown from Amsterdam can arrive fresh anywhere within 48 hours. Is that possible? When energy is cheap, yes. Third, specialization exploded. Taiwan makes chips, Germany makes machinery, Bangladesh makes textiles. Because every country could focus on what it did best and import the rest. This was the practical application of what economists call comparative advantage, and it only worked because energy was cheap. But every system has a breaking point, and we are now walking toward that point. Russia invaded Ukraine, and the world woke up as if from a deep sleep. Much of Europe had become dependent on Russian gas for years. Why? Because it was cheap. It came through pipelines. It was almost free. Then the gas stopped. And in Germany, factory electricity bills increased tenfold within 8 months. BASF, one of the largest chemical companies in the world, a 150-year-old German giant, it announced it would shrink production in Europe and invest more in China. Why? When energy was cheap, producing in Germany made sense. When energy became expensive, it no longer did. But this isn't only about Russia and Ukraine. It's the sudden acceleration of a much larger trend. The world has moved beyond the era of easy oil. In the 1930s, if you spent 1 barrel of energy to find oil in Texas, you could extract 100 barrels of oil. This is called the energy return ratio, 100 to 1. Today, the average oil well has a ratio closer to 10 to 1. In some regions, 5 to 1. That means a huge portion of the energy spent finding, extracting, and refining oil is now consumed by the oil process itself. The age of cheap energy is not over yet, but it is ending. And without cheap energy, the structure we call globalization begins to crack. When COVID-19 arrived, the world faced something strange. There were no masks. Why? Because masks were manufactured in China. There were no chips. Why? Because chips were made in Taiwan. There were no pharmaceutical raw materials. Why? Because 80% of those materials came from Asia. The global supply chain was efficient, but fragile. When energy was cheap, producing everything in the cheapest location made sense. But once access to that cheap location was disrupted, the system froze. And now, a reverse movement has begun. They call it reshoring, or friendshoring, or nearshoring. Different names, same idea. Bring production back. Shorten supply chains. Move production to reliable countries. America is pulling semiconductor factories back onto its own soil. Europe is trying to reduce dependence on Asia in critical industries. Japan is shifting factories from China to Vietnam and India. But here's the interesting paradox. What happens when production comes back? Costs rise. Because now you're manufacturing in Germany or America, where labor is more expensive, energy is more expensive, and regulations are stricter. Where do those costs go? To you, the consumer, in the form of inflation. Why has inflation exploded everywhere over the last 3 to 4 years? Yes, money was printed. But underneath it all lies this reality. As the age of cheap energy and cheap globalization comes to an end, the bubble inflated by that cheapness has started to burst. Now let me ask you this. Why did the Iraq War happen? Afghanistan? Libya? Syria? The official answers. Fighting terrorism, democracy, human rights. But look at the map. Look at where these wars, interventions, and coups happened. Then place an energy map over it. Oil, natural gas, pipelines, transit routes. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented geopolitical reality available in open sources. Henry Kissinger said in 1973, "Control oil, and you control nations." That statement is still true today. Only the actors have changed. China is investing heavily in Africa. Why? Rare earth elements, lithium, cobalt, the raw materials that will power tomorrow's energy technologies. America protects Taiwan. But why really? Because Taiwan produces semiconductors. And semiconductors are the new oil of the digital economy. In the 20th century, power depended on who controlled oil. In the 21st century, power will depend on who controls clean energy technologies and their raw materials. Wars have not changed. Only what is being fought over has changed. And here comes the important question, one that will shape the next 30 years. Is a new era of cheap energy coming? Look at solar energy costs. In 2010, 1 megawatt hour of solar energy cost $400. By 2023, it had fallen to $30, a 90% decline in just over a decade. That is one of the fastest cost declines in history. Wind power and battery costs show similar trends. Lithium-ion battery costs have fallen 97% since 2010. If this trend continues, and there are strong reasons to believe it will, energy could become cheaper than ever before within the next 20 years. But, and this is a big but, solar and wind are intermittent. The sun doesn't always shine. The wind doesn't always blow. Solving this requires massive energy storage infrastructure, smart grids, new transmission lines, and building that infrastructure requires energy and raw materials. Cobalt, lithium, nickel, most of which are concentrated in geopolitically sensitive regions. The clean energy era is coming, but it will not arrive for free, and it will not arrive smoothly. There's also a wild card, nuclear fusion. In 2022, American researchers achieved net energy gain from a fusion reaction for the first time. Small, yes, but still a first. If fusion ever becomes commercially viable, nearly infinite clean energy from seawater, it would become the greatest leap in human history, bigger than the discovery of fire. But fusion is still 20 years away, and people have been saying that since the 1970s. Humanity has spent 300 years living in a world built on the cheap energy created by fossil fuels. But now the foundation of that energy is shaking. Because of climate change, we cannot continue consuming fossil fuels forever. Because of geopolitics, energy resources are increasingly used as weapons. And because of physics, easily accessible oil and gas reserves are running out. And during the transition to a new energy era, pain is inevitable. Energy becomes more expensive, supply chains are restructured, geopolitical balances shift. So let me leave you with one final question. Was globalization truly a choice? Or was it simply the unavoidable consequence of cheap energy? And if that's true, as energy becomes more expensive, will globalization retreat as well? Or will new clean energy restore cheapness and reunite the world once again? Write your answer in the comments.